Welcome to Bedtime, Scaries. It was just a simple project. They'd done it hundreds of times before. Just let the balloon go and see what comes back. It was just a simple project. Tonight's story is part 3 of Penpal by Dathan Auerbach, titled Boxes. I spent the summer before kindergarten learning how to climb trees. There was an abundance of trees in my neighborhood, but there was one particular pine tree right outside my house that seemed almost designed for me. It had branches that were so low I could grab them easily without a boost, and for the first couple days after I learned how to pull myself up, I would just sit on the lowest branch, dangling my feet. The tree was outside our back fence and was easily visible from the living room of our house. Before too long, and without explicitly discussing that this would be the arrangement, my mother and I developed a routine where I would go play on the tree when she would watch her TV shows, since she could easily see me while she did other things. This was unlike our trips to the YMCA pool, where I would insist that she watch every movement of my amazing ability to keep my head underwater, sometimes for up to 10 minutes. She never seemed that impressed, though I think it was because I was breathing the entire time through a snorkel. As the summer passed, my abilities grew. Dangling my feet while sitting on a branch quickly lost its appeal, so I had begun to move up the branches, and before too long, I was climbing fairly high. As I climbed farther up the tree, I discovered that its branches not only got thinner, but also more widely spaced, and so eventually I reached a point where I couldn't actually climb any higher. This meant that the game had to change. I began to concentrate on speed, and in the end, I could reach my highest branch in 25 seconds. In my mind, I was quite a skilled climber, but my expertise was specialized. I only ever climbed that particular tree, and I always took the same path. I had worn off the bark on some of the branches from grinding my shoes and wringing of my hands as I moved from one branch to another in the same familiar path. I got too confident, and one afternoon I tried to step from a branch before I had firmly grasped the next one. I fell about 20 feet, and when I hit the earth, all the air was violently pushed out of my lungs. Dazed, I attempted to get up, but as I put more weight on my left arm, it failed me, and I fell back on the ground. When I looked at the arm that had betrayed me, I understood that I had simply asked too much of it. My forearm was twisted and bent like my tree's roots. When I tried to move my fingers, I found that they either all moved together or not at all. My mom was running towards me yelling something, and I remember her sounding just like she was underwater. I don't recall what she said, but I do remember being surprised by just how white my bone was. I couldn't climb trees anymore after that. I was going to start kindergarten with a cast, and wouldn't even have any friends to sign it. My mother and I had put a great deal of preparation into making my first day of school a success, but we weren't prepared for this. She must have felt terrible, because the day I started school, she brought home a kitten. He was just a baby, and was striped with tan and white, and he was a talker. The soundtrack of my excitement was a never-ending series of short but continuous cries. The cat squirmed a little in my mom's arms and fanned his toes as he extended his legs. She kissed him on the head and bent toward the floor to release him. As soon as she put him down, he crawled into an empty case of soda that was sitting on the floor. I named him Boxes. Boxes was only an outside cat when he escaped. Sometime, long before I was born, my mom had a cat that had apparently decimated the furniture. In the interest of having both a cat and places to sit, my mom had Boxes declawed. As a result, we did our best to keep him inside. Despite our best efforts, he would still escape every now and then, and we'd find him somewhere in the backyard chasing some kind of bug or lizard. Most of the time, his prey would simply elude him, the old-fashioned way, but there were a couple times when I approached Boxes in the backyard and saw that he had pinned some poor small animal. But without fail, the tiny creature would pull itself forward and slide through Boxes' clawless paws, and he would watch in horrified disbelief as his prize literally slipped through his fingers. Boxes could sometimes be as evasive as the lizards he stalked, but we'd always catch him and carry him back inside. He'd scramble to look back over my shoulder, meowing the whole way. I told my mom it was because he was planning his strategy for next time, and warning the lizards that he'd be back. Once we were back inside, we'd give him some tuna fish. Partly due to this ritual, Boxes learned what the sound of an electric can opener might signal, and he would come running whenever he heard it. Most of the time my mother wasn't opening cans of tuna, but Boxes would howl until she put the can on the ground for him. He would smell it and then look up at her in disgust as if he was thinking, "What is this? Soup?" This can opener conditioning came in handy, because toward the end of our time in that house, Boxes would get out much more often. He would run into the crawl space under the house where neither Mom or I wanted to follow, because it was cramped and probably festering with bugs and rodents. We attempted to get him out by calling his name, but when that failed, it seemed like we might have to just wait for him to come out on his own accord. Ingeniously, my mom thought to hook the can opener to an extension cord and run it just outside the opening that Boxes had gone through. Each time, he would inevitably emerge with his loud meows, while causing a miniature sandstorm as he shook the dirt out of his fur. He would look up at us, excited by the sound, and then horrified at how we would orchestrate such a cruel ruse. A can opener with no tuna made no sense to Boxes. The last time he escaped to under the house was actually our last day in it. The summer between 1st and 2nd grade had just started, and our house had already been on the market for a couple of months. I didn't want to move, and I protested as sincerely as I could. But my mother told me that the schools were better elsewhere. Of course, I didn't care about that, but there was no discussion to be had. My mom had already found a new house in another part of the city, so we had begun packing our things slowly so that we'd be ready to move when our house finally sold. We didn't have much, and I had already packed up all of my clothes at my mom's request. She could tell that I was really sad about moving, so she wanted the transition to be smooth for me. I guess she thought that having my clothes in the box would greatly reinforce the idea that we were moving, and if it all happened gradually enough, it might be easier for me to accept it when the day finally came. I guess it worked in a way, but even after months of having all my clothes packed up, the room still felt like my room. A little over a week before we were supposed to move, we were carrying some of our things out to the car when Boxes seized the opportunity and ran full tilt into the yard. My mom scrambled to catch him, but the cat evaded her and ran under the house. She cursed that she had already packed the can opener and wasn't sure where it was, and she tried hopelessly to lure him out by calling him while I pretended to go look for the can opener, so that I wouldn't have to go under the house in pursuit. Eventually, my mom, probably completely aware of my scam, moved one of the panels on the side of the house and went into the crawl space. I stood outside the opening, listening to my mother's rustling under the house. "Watch for him!" she called to me, and so I crouched down just in front of the hole, ready to catch Boxes if he ran out. "Come here!" my mother roared, and I heard Boxes howl as he often would when he was caught. My mom came out with Boxes quickly and seemed unnerved, which made me feel even better about not having had to go in there myself. She took him inside and made some phone calls while I sat in the bottom bunk of my bed and played with a Ninja Turtle action figure. I waited eagerly for Josh's parents to drop him off so we could play. A couple of minutes later, my mother came into my room. She was still covered in dirt from having crawled under the house, and when she moved, I could sometimes see the dirt break loose from her skin and rain down onto the carpet of my floor. The unhinged look in her eyes was still there, and, holding the phone tightly in her hand, she told me that she had spoken to the realtor, and we were going to move into the other house right away. She said it as if it were excellent news, but I had thought we had more time in the house. We weren't supposed to move until the end of next week, and it was only Tuesday. We weren't even finished packing yet, but my mom said sometimes it's just easier to replace things than pack them and haul them all over the city. I didn't even get to grab the rest of my boxed clothes as Mom ushered me out of my room and out the back door. "What about Josh?" I protested. "What about him?" she snapped. I reminded her that he was supposed to come later that day, and she said that we would have to reschedule our playdate. I asked if I could at least call him to say goodbye, and she said that I could just call him from our new house. We left in the moving van, and I watched my home and my entire life slide out of sight as we rounded the bend and exited the neighborhood. I had left my home behind, but I managed to stay in touch with Josh over the next several years, which was surprising since we no longer went to the same school. Our parents weren't close friends, but they knew that we were, so they would accommodate our desire to see one another by driving us back and forth for sleepovers, sometimes every weekend. The distance did little to weaken the strength of our friendship. As a matter of fact, in many ways our bond actually grew stronger. Being farther apart meant that nurturing the friendship was no longer as easy as taking a 5-minute car ride or waiting a couple extra stops in the school bus. We had to work to stay friends now, and I think that helped us appreciate what we had. At Christmas, after the summer that I moved away, I got a number of presents, but only one that I really remember. I unwrapped a box and opened it to see a walkie-talkie. It wasn't in any kind of packaging, and the cold utilitarian design stood out in sharp contrast to the brightly colored tissue paper that lay under it. I gave my mom a quizzical and confused look as I picked it up. It was a little heavy for me, and it seemed pretty sturdy. As I ran my eyes over its knobs and buttons, my mom smiled and told me to give it a try while tapping the rectangular protrusion on the side of the walkie. I pressed the button and spoke. "Hello?" I waited, but there was no response. I looked back up at my mom, who knelt down and looked at the top of the walkie-talkie, and then at the piece of paper she had in her hand. She turned one of the knobs and told me to try again. "Hello?" I waited again, but it was still silent. I was starting to think that she might be playing a trick on me, when the sound of static burst through the speaker on the walkie. The acoustic fuzz gave way to a voice. "Hey, you there? Josh? Yeah, man, this is so cool." I looked up at my mom, and she was looking down at me with a warm smile on her face. Josh was still chattering away on the walkie-talkie, his sentences awkwardly punctuated in the middle by sharp pulses of static. My mom said, "Merry Christmas," and bent down to hug me. Our parents had pooled their money to get us these walkie-talkies. They were very nice, too nice for boys in the 2nd grade, and were advertised to work across the range that extended past the distance between our houses. They also had batteries that could last for days if the walkie-talkie was on but not used. The walkies would only occasionally work well enough that we could talk across the city, but when we stayed over at each other's houses, we'd use them around the house, talking in mock radio speak that we had taken from movies, and they worked great for that. Every now and then, when I stayed at Josh's house, we would manage to sneak away and continue our explorations in the woods, but these adventures were never sanctioned. My mom had told Josh's parents that she didn't want me going off into the woods. She said she worried that I might get hurt, and she just wasn't comfortable with taking that chance when she was miles away, despite the fact that Josh's mother was a nurse. This restriction was actually fine, since there was a good number of things to do at Josh's house, and I liked being there. His parents were both nice, and were very rarely at the house at the same time, since they kept different schedules. Josh's mom was a nurse at the same hospital that put my arm in a cast when I fell from the tree, and his dad was a construction worker. He was a big man, but he also seemed genuinely kind. He had caught us playing in the woods once, when I was staying the weekend with Josh. And when I begged Josh's father not to tell my mom, he talked to me like an adult, even though I was only 8 years old. He explained why I had to tell her, and why I shouldn't ask him to lie. Of course, I still didn't want him to tell my mother, but the fact that he was willing to actually talk to me about it made it easier to accept. My mom had screamed furiously at me and threatened to ban me from going to Josh's house ever again. I couldn't fully understand the severe reaction, but I didn't want to lose Josh as a friend. So when I visited him, we played video games and played in his room, and Josh and I continued to be ferried to each other's house almost every weekend. I never really thought about it, but the fact that our friendship didn't atrophy when I moved away was mostly thanks to the efforts that our parents made. Thanks to them, we were still friends when we were 10 years old. One weekend in 5th grade, I was staying at Josh's, and my mom called me to say goodnight. She was still pretty watchful, even when she couldn't actually watch me, but I had gotten so used to it that I didn't even notice it, even if Josh did. She sounded upset, so I asked her if I had done something. She told me that Boxes was missing. This must have been a Saturday night because I was going home the next day, since there was school on Monday. Boxes had been missing since Friday afternoon. I gathered that my mother had not seen him since returning home after dropping me off at Josh's the day before. She must have decided to tell me he was missing because if he didn't come home before I did, then I would be devastated. Not only by his absence, but by the fact that she had kept it from me. She told me not to worry. He'll come back. He always does. But Boxes didn't come back. 3 weekends later, I stayed at Josh's again. I'd spent every day after school walking around the neighborhood calling out for Boxes, and listening, and hoping to hear him. I could think of almost nothing but finding my cat, and was noticeably downtrodden by his absence. He was my oldest friend. My mom told me that there had been many times when pets had disappeared from home for weeks or even months, only to return on their own. She had said they always knew where home was, and would always try to get back. I was explaining this to Josh when a thought struck me so hard that I interrupted my own sentence to say it out loud. What if Boxes thought of the wrong home? Josh was confused. What? He lives with you. He knows where home is. Yeah, but he grew up somewhere else, Josh. He was raised in my old house. Maybe he still thinks of that place as home, like I do. Oh, I get it. Well, that'd be great. We'll tell my dad tomorrow. He'll take us over so we can look. No, he won't. Mom said we couldn't ever go back to that place because the new owners don't want to be bothered. She said that she told your mom and dad the same thing. Josh persisted. Okay, then we'll just go out exploring tomorrow and make our way to your old house. No, come on, Josh. Remember the last time they caught us playing in the woods? Even if your dad doesn't catch us, if we get spotted, your dad will find out and then so will my mom. I wouldn't be allowed to come spend the night anymore. My old house is just a couple neighborhoods away. We sat there, silent, in his room for a moment, before I said what I think Josh already knew I was going to say. We have to go there ourselves. We have to go there tonight. It didn't take that much convincing to get Josh on board, since he was usually the one to come up with ideas like this. But we never snuck out of his house before. While we waited until everyone was asleep, we discussed our strategy for getting there, while also debating how we would explain Box's sudden appearance to our parents, if we should happen to find him. About an hour after Josh's parents came in to tell us to go to bed, we crept out of Josh's room to find a flashlight. Josh knew his dad had several, but he had no idea where he kept them. The garage seemed like the most obvious place. We moved silently through the house and eased the interior door of the garage open. It gave a faint squeak, and we paused before pulling it open and passing through the doorway. I went to turn the light on, and Josh hissed at me. There was no real way that the light in the garage would have woken anyone in the house up, but when you're attempting to be discreet, it's hard to know where to draw the line. Suddenly, all actions become covert by default. Like when two friends begin whispering, and after a while they find that all their voices are still hushed, but they can't remember why. It was appropriate enough to comb through the garage in darkness, though. Using light to find itself seemed like cheating anyways. Josh's dad had hundreds of tools, and we both squinted, trying to see through the darkness to determine if one of them might be what we needed. If we had needed a wrench instead of a light, we would have been in business. "Hey," Josh broke the silence. "What?" "Hey, man." "What?" I whispered as loudly as I could. "I can't see anything in here." "I know. Me neither. Do you have a flashlight I could borrow?" There was a slight pause before he followed his joke with, "Get it?" At which point, my hands shot up to my mouth as I attempted to hold back the laughter that was building inside me. I had been in many situations before where I wanted to laugh but couldn't. I was a veteran of those battles. But in almost all occasions, I would permit myself a faint chuckle. Or at least, I would have the forbidding stare of my mother to anchor me. Here, my throat clicked and my body shook as I struggled to subdue myself. I looked at Josh. He was in even worse shape. Tears were running down his cheeks, and he was actually biting his hand to suppress a rising fit. Josh and I stood with our hands to our mouths, allowing only the occasional snort or squeak to escape. The more I saw him trying to hold back his laughter, the more I felt I no longer could. As I sensed the storm reaching its crescendo, I quickly turned around so I wouldn't be caught in the feedback loop with Josh, and gradually I calmed myself down. As I regained composure and could focus on something other than being quiet, I saw a flashlight sitting on a workbench. I walked over to pick it up and followed Josh back into the house. When we were walking back to Josh's room, I could still feel the rumblings of laughter in my chest. The situation had passed, and I had stifled myself, but just as you can suppress a sneeze with enough effort, the irritants were still there. Before I could even think to stop myself, I began giggling in the hallway, and Josh shushed me harshly as he ushered me into his room. "Sorry, man," I managed to force out amongst my laughter. "Dude, shut up!" Josh snapped. "You'll wake up Veronica." I had been focusing so hard on not laughing in the garage that, after the dam had finally breached, I had forgotten for a moment that Josh's room was right across the hall from his older sister's. I was so embarrassed by the thought of her hearing me giggle that the laughter inside me died, and with it went the brief moment of forgetfulness about why we had gone looking for the flashlight to begin with. "You ready?" I asked Josh. "Yeah. Is this everything?" he said, as he gestured towards the flashlight while picking up the walkie-talkies. I felt a little foolish. I hadn't even thought to bring the walkie-talkies, despite the fact that this was the one time where we might actually get to use them. "Yeah, I think so," I responded coolly. "Let's go." Escaping Josh's house turned out to be much easier than finding a flashlight in it. The window in his room opened to the backyard, and he had a latched wooden fence that wasn't locked. The fence opened to the side of the house, and we crept along quietly as we passed under his parents' bedroom window. We made a sharp turn away from his house and towards the trash can-lined street. Once we were in the clear, we slipped off into the night, the flashlight and walkie-talkies in hand. There were 2 ways to get from Josh's house to my old house. We could walk on the street and make all the turns, or go through the woods, which would take about half the time. It would have taken about 2 hours to walk there, taking the street, but I suggested we go that way anyway. I told him it was because I didn't want to get lost. Josh scoffed at this idea and insisted that between the two of us, we would have no trouble finding our way. I pointed out that it had been years since I walked through these woods. He waved his hands at me dismissively and said that he doubted that anyone ever knew these woods better than us after the lengths that we had gone to in order to explore them, even at night. "But what about when we were kids? You remember how thick the woods get." "But we're not kids anymore," he responded. Before I could rebut, he added that if we were seen walking on the street, someone might recognize him and tell his dad. He threatened to go home if we didn't just take the shortcut. I accepted his preference because I didn't want to go by myself. Nervously, I turned with Josh toward the line of trees across the vacant lot and walked on. Josh didn't know about the last time I walked through these woods at night, and how hard it had been to find my way out. The woods seemed much less frightening than I remembered. I was older now. and I found that with a friend and a flashlight, the trees seemed less ominous, and the sounds less foreboding. We seemed to be making pretty good time, too, though I wasn't entirely sure where we were. But Josh appeared confident enough, and that bolstered my morale. While not infused with the general eeriness that I had expected, there was still something surreal about the woods. This feeling was, I'm sure, at least partially informed by my memories of this place. But there was something about the way the trees twisted together in the dim light of the moon, as the wind rustled and whistled through them, that made it feel like a wholly different place than it was during the day. The fact that a place this untamed was wedged between stretches of houses and neighborhoods made it seem even more bizarre. But in truth, I knew there was nothing strange about any of this. My thoughts were just wandering as I tried to think about anything other than what it was like to be lost in these woods. I needed to break the silence. How much farther do you think it is? We were on Josh's side of the woods, so I thought he might have a better sense of the distance. I don't know, a while, I guess. Well, what's a while mean? I don't know, man. On the bright side, how far can you walk into the woods, right? The question reverberated into my ears. What did you say? I uttered flatly, as my feet dragged to a halt. Josh turned his head back a little over his shoulder and said with a half grin, How far can you walk into the woods? My face felt hot. That question. I hadn't thought of that question in years, since the night it replayed over and over in my head as I walked what could have been the same path we were taking now. And with that question now again ringing in my ears, the same panicked feelings that had prompted me to think of it that night as I wandered endlessly through this place began to return. I couldn't think of why he would say that or where he'd even heard it. My mind began whirling in a gyre as it clouded with that familiar feeling of being certain that you're dreaming while also knowing that you're not. Josh hadn't stopped walking when I had, but I could hear him just up ahead of me, and I could see the meandering of the flashlight's beam through the trees. I began walking again and caught up with my friend. The bush was getting thicker and the trees more tangled. As we negotiated our way through it all, I was about to press Josh about what he had just said, when the strap on my walkie-talkie got caught on a branch. Josh had the flashlight, and as I was struggling to get the walkie free, I heard Josh say, "Hey man, wanna go for a swim?" I looked over to where he was shining the flashlight, but I closed my eyes as I did, because I now knew where we were, and I hoped that, somehow, I was wrong. Slowly and fearfully, I opened my eyes and saw that he was shining the light on the pool float. This was where I had woken up, in these woods, all those years ago. I felt a lump in my throat and a sting of fresh tears in my eyes as I continued to struggle with the walkie-talkie. I didn't want to be there. It hadn't even occurred to me that we might find this place, and once we did, I just wanted to keep walking and leave it behind me for a second time. But as the branch clung determinedly to the strap, I found myself trapped there again. Frustrated, I yanked on the walkie hard enough to break the branch that held it, and I turned and walked towards Josh, who had partially reclined on the pool float in a mock sunbathing pose. I didn't want to tell Josh how I had first found this place, so I knew that I had to temper my desperation to leave it. Slowing my pace, I tried to collect myself, and Josh, either in an attempt to light my way or obscure it, shined the flashlight directly in my face. The whole world went white for a moment, and even after Josh moved the light, the impression remained. I couldn't see anything, not even the hole. I felt the dirt around the edge of the chasm give way, and I reeled back in an attempt to regain my balance, but it was not enough. I tumbled into the crater. It was only a few feet deep, but it had a fairly large perimeter. I was puzzled. I remembered this place vividly from that night. The topography of this particular area was etched deeply into my mind, but I didn't remember that hole. I rose to my knees as I tried to wind back my mind's clock. and then I heard Josh scream. I rose to my feet quickly and scrambled out of the hole. I tried to see what was happening, but Josh had the flashlight, and its beam moved wildly through the darkness as he flailed frantically on the float. He was panicked, and as the light shot sporadically across his face, I could see it was contorted with fear and desperation. "What's wrong, Josh?" I yelled. But he didn't respond with anything more than the same cries that had pulled me out of the hole. He was trying to get up, but every time he would rise up even a little, he would fall immediately back on the float, and the whole process would begin anew. I wanted to help Josh, but I couldn't move myself any closer. My legs wouldn't cooperate. I hated these woods. Josh threw the flashlight to free his hand, and I stared at it, still unable to break my paralysis. It wasn't until Josh roared coherently that he needed help that I was able to force myself to move. I ran and grabbed a discarded flashlight. I shined it on my friend, not knowing what to expect. The light washed over his body, and I could see he was writhing violently, the weathered and worn shark-shaped float distending underneath him. At first, I couldn't see anything near him that would be causing his panic. I shifted my gaze from the surroundings and back to Josh and stepped closer. His plight came into view. Spiders. There were dozens of them crawling in crisscrossing patterns along his arms and across his torso. There must have been a clutch of them in the float. The closer I got, the more there seemed to be as my eyes became better able to distinguish their small bodies. Josh's hands repeatedly returned to his face to wipe it clean of any spiders that might make the journey up there. His frightened and rapid movements stood once again in stark contrast to my resumed static state. Josh was not really afraid of spiders, at least not by the thought or sight of them, but I was. I stood there and wished Josh had been plagued by something else. Anything else. But I had to do something for him. He would have done something for me. Setting the flashlight on the ground, I ran to my friend and shut all thoughts of spiders out of my mind. If I thought about them, I would stop thinking about helping Josh. I grabbed his arms and leveraged back, pulling him up as steadily and strongly as I could. Once on his feet, he yanked off his shirt and began savagely beating it against the ground while I tried to brush the remaining spiders from his arms and neck. When the urgency had passed, we stood there for a moment, surveying one another and ourselves, picking and brushing the odd spider off the other, and occasionally slapping our hands against our own bodies in response to some tickling rogue hair or leaf. From a distance, we must have looked like two monkeys with neurological disorders. When the danger seemed to have passed and the spasms stopped, I bent down, picked up Josh's shirt, and handed it to him. He snatched it out of my hands and shook it violently in case there were any stowaway arachnids, and after he had pulled it over his head and slid his arms through, he leaned forward and said with the kind of tone you might hear in someone's voice as they were punctuating a great argument with a final point, "Fuck spiders." We walked on. I had my bearings back, and Josh knew we were in my part of the woods, so he dropped back a little and I took the lead. We were getting closer to my house now, so we became more focused on what had brought us into the woods in the first place. Boxes was my cat, but Josh had known him for almost as long as I had. So long, in fact, that Josh had his own set of stories about my cat. When we were in first grade, Josh was staying at my house for the night and was sleeping on the bottom bunk. At some point, while he slept, Boxes climbed into bed with him, and was still there when he woke up the next morning. Josh told me that when he opened his eyes, Boxes was laying about a foot away from his face and was staring right at him. Josh said, or at least implied, that for a moment he felt like they were sharing something special, that they were making some kind of a connection. This moment lasted right up until Josh smiled and Boxes smacked him in the face with his clawless paws, quickly and repeatedly, just before he dashed out of the room, leaving Josh dazed. Of course, I didn't witness any of this, but I was somewhat privy to the conclusion since Josh's shouts were what woke me up that morning. That night, as we walked through the woods, drawing ever closer to my old house, we took turns, telling different parts of that story to one another. We continued on our path, but but as soon as we passed a pile of dead Christmas trees, its weathered ornaments still healthy enough to catch the faintest light and cast it away, what Josh had said earlier about our journey still tugged at my thoughts. I confronted him abruptly. "Why'd you say what you said back there?" "What? About boxes biting me on the nose? I swear he did." "No, not that. You asked how far we could go into the woods. Why'd you ask that?" "Huh? Oh, I don't know. I thought it'd be funny." "Yeah, but where'd you hear that question? Why would you ask me that?" I was trying not to let on that it had upset me. "It's a riddle. You told me that stupid riddle in kindergarten." "What? I don't remember that." "Come on, are you serious? It was the day we let our balloons go. I guess you finished your work, yeah, that's right. Because it was before your paper got all messed up. You came up to me when I was finishing mine, and we started talking about how we'd explore the woods at your house and stuff. And then you asked me how far I could go into the woods, but I didn't know what you meant. And when I tried to answer you, you just kept asking the stupid question over and over." "Oh, yeah." Josh started laughing. "And then you said I'd just have to figure it out, and you tried to be all mysterious. But then you just blurted out the answer like 10 seconds later." "Oh, yeah. No wonder you forgot. Would want to remember blowing a joke so bad." He punched me lightly in the arm, and I shoved him back playfully. We laughed as we walked through the ditch. We were back in my old neighborhood, and suddenly the task at hand seemed more daunting. It was probably about 1 o'clock in the morning. Most of the houses were dark inside, and there were no streetlights in this part of my old neighborhood, so our flashlight cut sharply through the darkness, and we saw only what the beam hit. I started to wonder how we were going to find boxes in such blackness. I found myself wishing we had another flashlight. The last time I had rounded the bend that was ahead of us, I had seen my house fully illuminated, and there was a part of me that expected to find it in the same state as Josh and I pressed forward, and the roof of my house appeared over the others. All the memories of what transpired that night came flooding back. In the woods, I had been hit with waves of flashes from the past, from the winter night when I was 6, and they would break and retreat back into the reservoir of my mind. But as I retraced my path on the paved road back to my house, for a moment, Josh seemed to fade away, and every step seemed to hurt, as if my feet had once again been cut open by the sharp sticks and thorny bushes of the wood's undergrowth. Although I was wearing shoes this time, I could almost feel the small asphalt pebbles that had wedged themselves into the cuts on the soles of my feet the last time I made this journey. "There's your house," Josh whispered. I snapped out of my daze and felt a skipping in my heart as we finally turned the corner, about to face the full view of my house. I remembered how incandescent it had been the last time, how light had poured out from every window. But this time, all the lights were off. Suddenly, my feet didn't hurt anymore. From a distance, I could see my old climbing tree. It looked smaller than I remembered, but my memories of scaling that tree had transformed it into a redwood in my mind. I could make out the rim of branches that were lowest to the ground, the ones that I used to sit on when I first learned how to climb. That tree was the source of so many memories for me, and they were all good ones, even the ones where I had fallen. It had been in that same spot years before I was in any spot at all, oblivious to all that had transpired around it, or who it had affected, and it would probably remain there after I was gone if it was left alone. As my mind traced the steps of causality backwards, I realized that I wouldn't be back here this night if that tree hadn't grown, and I was briefly in awe of how all events were like that. As we got close, I could see that the grass in the yard now reached half the height of the chain-link fence that encircled it. I couldn't even guess when it had last been mowed. One of the window shutters had partially broken loose and was awkwardly rocking back and forth in the breeze. Overall, the house just looked dirty, as if a thin film of grease and grime had coated the whole building, despite whatever rain there had been. It had never even occurred to me that the whole house could get filthy. I was sad to see my old home in such a state of disrepair. Why would my mom care if we bothered the new owners if they cared so little about where they lived? And then I realized there were no new owners. The house was abandoned, though it looked simply forsaken. It dawned on me how much work my mother must have put into the maintenance of the house if this is what it looked like when no one bothered. It was like seeing an old friend who had become terminally ill, and it broke my heart. I couldn't help but wonder why my mom would lie to me about our house having new occupants. Maybe she just didn't want me to see it like this. Despite how sad it made me, I realized that this vacancy was actually a good thing. Since there was no one to take care of the house, there was no one to stop us from looking for my cat. It would be so much easier to look around for boxes if we didn't have to worry about being spotted by the new family. This meant that we could probably make it out there faster, which was my top priority. Josh interrupted my thoughts as we walked through the gate and up to the house itself. "Your old house sucks, dude," Josh yelled as quietly as he could. "Shut up, Josh. Even like this is probably still more fun than your house." "Hey, man. Okay. I think boxes is probably under the house. One of us has to climb under and look, but the other should stay out here next to the opening in case he comes running out." For a moment, I kicked myself for not bringing an electronic cabinet opener from Josh's house, forgetting that there would have been no electricity to power it here. "Are you serious? There's no way I'm going under there. It's your cat, man. You do it." That should have settled the question of who went in after boxes. But I wasn't going to forfeit so quickly. Any chance I had of not crawling under the house was worth taking. "Look, I'll game it for you, unless you're too scared," I said, holding my fist over my upturned palm. "Fine, but we go on shoot, not on 3. It's rock, paper, scissors, shoot, not 1, 2, 3. I know how to play the game, Josh. You're the one who always messes up, and it's 2 out of 3. We each balled one hand into a fist and held it over our palms. I began to count, and on each word we thrust our hands downward in a stabbing motion until they collided with our palms. "Rock, paper, scissors, shoot!" I brought my hand down, maintaining the fist, and held it there. Josh's hands clapped on his final throw. His paper beat my rock. We began again. "Rock, paper, scissors, shoot!" I guessed that Josh would count on me throwing rock again, and I almost did. At the last second, I changed my mind and laid my hands together flatly. I looked at Josh. He was pointing 2 fingers at me, as if to signal the number 2. He had guessed what I'd do, or had just gotten lucky. Either way, his scissors beat my paper. I lost. It was obvious that Josh wanted to gloat, but he restrained himself. He wasn't happy that anyone had to go under this house. I wriggled loose the panel that my mom would always move when she had to crawl under after boxes. I had removed it myself only once, but that had been a long time ago. I pushed it in hard and then twisted it a little before pulling it out and resting it against the side of the house. My mom had only had to crawl underneath the house a handful of times, since the can opener trick usually worked. But when she had to do it, she hated it, especially the final time. As I looked into the darkness of the crawl space, I had a greater appreciation for why that was. Before we moved, my mother said it was actually better that boxes ran under there, despite how hard it would be to get him out. It was less dangerous than him jumping over the fence and running around the neighborhood. All that was true, but I was still dreading going into the crawl space. I turned back towards Josh and smiled. "Best 5 out of 7? He laughed and told me to watch my head on the way in. I grabbed the flashlight and the walkie and began to crawl into the opening. Upon setting my hand on the ground underneath the house, I realized that I was about to ruin my favorite shirt. The ground of the crawl space was nothing more than damp dirt, which would create a problem for the white shirt I was wearing. My mom had gotten it for me at a souvenir shop when we visited my grandparents the previous year. It had an iguana wearing sunglasses and a Hawaiian shirt, lying in a beach chair, sipping a drink out of a glass with a straw. Beneath the lizard, in big green letters, said, "Iguana another fly tie." I had no idea what that meant, but after about 10 minutes of nagging, my mom paid to have the design ironed onto a shirt my size. My mind started turning. There would be no way for me to come out of this exploration without being filthy, and I would have to explain the state of my clothes to Josh's parents. This complicated things. I turned back towards Josh. "Hey, I can't be the one who goes under, man. It'll ruin my shirt, and your parents will know we were outside." Josh stood there with a slightly amused but quizzical look on his face. Finally, he answered, "Wait, you're serious? Dude, look at your shirt." I looked down and saw that it already advertised my activities with thick skids of soil that streaked up and down and across it. I felt slightly foolish. We had just walked through the woods. I had fallen in a hole, but I still pictured my shirt in mint condition. I played it off as a joke and turned back towards the opening. As I moved the upper half of my body into the crawl space, my concerns turned to other things as a powerful smell overtook me. It smelled like death. I turned on my walkie. "Josh, are you there?" "This is Macho Man, come back." "Josh, cut it out. There's something down here." "What do you mean?" "It stinks. It smells like something died." "Oh man, is it boxes?" "I really hope not." I set down the walkie and oscillated the flashlight as I crawled forward a little, trying to survey as much as possible from my current position. Looking through the hole from the outside, you could see all the way back with the right lighting, but you had to be inside the crawl space to see around the support blocks that held the house up. I'd say that about 40% of the area wasn't visible unless you were actually in the crawl space. But even inside, I could only see directly where the flashlight was pointing. This would make scouting around the place much more difficult. I tried to call my cat. "Boxes." I paused and listened. "Boxes." There was no sound or movement. I tried clicking my tongue against the roof of my mouth, but there was no response from that either. Pressing my hands hard against the earth, I pulled myself forward until my feet slipped past the opening and into the crawl space. As I moved farther into the void, the smell intensified to the point that it stung my nostrils. If I covered my nose with my hand, I couldn't properly leverage myself into the cramped space. That meant in order to move, I had to breathe the air directly. When I tried breathing through my mouth, the stench in the air layered on my tongue and coated the inside of my cheeks to the point that I could actually taste it. For the entire journey from Josh's house to my old home, I had hoped we'd find boxes there. But now the fear was growing in me that boxes had come here, and something had happened to him. I began hoping for the first time that I wouldn't find boxes at all. I twisted my body and tried to look around with the light, but I couldn't see much of anything. The foulness of the rotten air now lined my throat, and I coughed and spat reflexively to remove it. I needed to hurry up so I could leave this place. Reaching my arm forward, I wrapped my fingers around a support block to pull myself forward. And as I did that, I felt something that made my hand recoil. Fur. My heart sank, and I prepared myself emotionally for what I was about to see. I crawled slowly so that I could prolong what I knew was coming. And I inched my eyes and the flashlight past the block to see what was on the other side. I staggered back in horror and disgust. "Jesus Christ!" escaped my trembling mouth. It was a hideous and twisted creature, badly decomposed. Its skin had rotted away on its face, so the teeth were revealed in an ever-present sneer that made them look enormous. Its eyes had either sunk back into its skull or were simply gone altogether, but I still felt like it was looking right at me. The smell radiating from it was unbearable.
What is it? Are you okay? Is it boxes?
I reached for the walkie.
No, I don't think so. Well, what the hell is it then?
I don't know. I shined the light on it again and looked at it with less fear in my vision. I chuckled, though I felt bad for doing so. It's a raccoon.
Well, keep looking. I'm gonna go in the house to see if he might have made it in there somehow.
What? No! Josh, don't go in there. What if Boxes is down here and he runs out? He can't. I put the board back. I looked and saw that he was telling the truth.
Why'd you do that?
Don't worry, man. You can move it easy. Doing it this way makes more sense. If Boxes ran out and I missed him, then he'd be gone. But if he's down there, then it'd be easier for you to grab him. And then you can just radio me and I'll come move the board. If he's not down there, then you can move it yourself and meet me in the house. I thought of the times that my mother had tried to catch Boxes either running out of the house or sprinting around the backyard. Josh had a point. In fact, this plan seemed more thoroughly thought out than our entire mission. Still, I liked the idea of him being just outside, even if he wasn't doing anything productive. It was just good to have him there. But we'd save time this way, and we needed all the time we could get. Both of Josh's parents got up early, and I would still have to try to clean my clothes after crawling around under the house. I didn't want him to abandon his post, but there was always a chance he wouldn't be able to get in anyway. Hesitantly, I radioed back. Okay, but be careful. Don't touch anything. Don't worry, man. I won't touch your Barbie collection. I laughed. You remember your way inside, right? Yeah, I think so. Where do you think I should look? I thought for a moment. He used to sit on the washer or dryer sometimes, but if he's not there, then try my room. There's a bunch of my old clothes still in boxes there. Check to see if he crawled in one, I guess. And make sure you bring your walkie. Roger that, good buddy, Josh replied. I realized only then that it would be pitch black in there. The power would have been turned off since no one was paying the bill. With any luck, he'd be able to see from the streetlights on the other side of the house that might cast some light inside. Otherwise, I wasn't sure how he'd find his way around, or how he'd find Boxes, for that matter. Before too long, I heard footsteps right over my head, and felt old dirt raining down on me. Josh, is that you? Breaker, this is Macho Man coming back from Big Tango Foxtrot. The Eagle has landed. What's your 20, Princess Jasmine? Over. Asshole, I muttered to myself. Macho Man, you know that you don't have to make the walkie-talkie noise when we're actually on walkie-talkies, right? And my 20 is in your bathroom looking at your stash of magazines, good buddy. Looks like you've got a thing for dudes' butts. What's a report on that? Over. I could hear him laughing through the walkie, and I started laughing too. I heard the footsteps fade away a little. He was on his way to my room. Man, it's dark in here. Alright, hey, are you sure you had boxes of clothes in here? I don't see any. Yeah, there should be a couple boxes in front of the closet. There aren't any boxes. Let me check to see if you maybe put them in the closet or something before you left. I knew I hadn't done that. I started thinking that maybe my mom had come back and gotten the clothes and just given them away because I had outgrown a lot of them. But I remembered leaving the boxes there. I didn't even have time to close the last one up before we left so abruptly that summer. While I was waiting for Josh to tell me what he found, I felt a tingling on my foot, and thoughts of spiders surged back into my mind. I kicked out my leg quickly, and the sensation subdued. There were no spiders. My leg had fallen asleep, due to the position I'd been laying in. As the feeling returned to my foot, I became aware of the fact that it was now resting on something other than mounds of dirt. I turned my head back and stared, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. My foot was resting on a bowl that lay among scattering of other bowls. I turned my body, crawled a little closer to the collection, and saw that most of the bowls were lying on a brown blanket that was quite difficult to see in this darkness, since it was earth-colored.
The blanket smelled moldy, and most of the bowls were empty. But one had something that I recognized still in it. Cat food. It was a different kind of food than we gave to boxes, and initially I couldn't understand why it would be down there of all places. Suddenly, I understood. If Boxes had ever escaped our backyard, there would have been a very good chance that he might have gotten hurt, since he didn't have his front claws. My mom must have set up a little place for him under the house to encourage him to come here instead of running around the neighborhood. That made a lot of sense, and it explained why Boxes had scampered under here as frequently as he had toward the end of our time in the house. Knowing about this place, it seems more likely that Boxes would have come back to it. "That's so cool, Mom," I thought, as the sound of static came through the walkie. "I found your clothes." "Oh, cool. Where are the boxes?" "Like I said, there's no boxes. Your clothes are in your closet. They're hanging up." I felt a chill. That was impossible. I had packed all my clothes. Even though we weren't supposed to move that day, I remembered having packing them weeks before, and thinking that it was stupid for me to have to get clothes out of a box only to put them back in. I had packed them, but now they were hung back up. Why, though? Josh needed to get out of there. "That can't be right, Josh. They're supposed to be in boxes. I put them in boxes. Stop messing around. Just come back outside." "No joke, man. I'm looking at them. Maybe you just thought you had left them all packed up." Haha, wow. Talk about an ego. "What? What do you mean?" "Your walls, man. Your walls are covered in Polaroids of yourself. There are, like, hundreds of them. What'd you hire someone to—" Silence. I checked my walkie to see if I'd switched it off somehow. It was on. Looking at the frequency knob to see if it had been moved, I could see that it was on the right channel. I could hear rapid footsteps in the house above me, but I couldn't tell exactly where Josh was going. I waited for Josh to finish his sentence, thinking that his finger had just slipped off the button, but he didn't continue. He seemed to be stomping around the house now. I was just about to radio him when his words whispered through the crackling walkie-talkie. "There's someone in the house." His voice was hushed and broken. I could hear that he was on the verge of tears. I wanted to respond, but how loud was his walkie turned up? What if the other person heard it? I couldn't take a chance that I'd lead this other person right to him. So I said nothing and just waited, hoped, and listened. What I heard were footsteps. Heavy, dragging footsteps. I tried to discern where they were going, but they seemed to be walking around aimlessly. Finally, they stopped. After only a moment, there was a loud thud a few feet above me, and I could hear the dirt and sand raining down from the underside of the floor onto the ground of the crawl space. Oh God. Josh! He'd been found. I was sure of it. This person had found him and was hurting him. I couldn't move. I wanted to run home. I wanted to save Josh. I wanted to go for help. I wanted so many things, but I just lay there, frozen and racked with guilt over the fact that I was failing my friend. It wasn't at all that I was unable to help him, as if I had tried and failed and felt I had let him down, as if I had tried to scramble out of this pit and rush inside to rescue him only to be thwarted and defeated. It was that I couldn't bring myself to try anything at all. I hadn't moved 1 inch, and he was my best friend in the world. He was my only friend, next to Boxes. I broke out in tears at the thought of Josh's fate, and at the knowledge of my own impotency when he needed me. And I cried even harder from the selfish fears that were stirring up inside me when I realized that Josh might have told this person where I was hiding, and that there was nothing I could possibly do. As I struggled to compose myself, I felt my heart flutter when I heard Josh's voice through the walkie-talkie. But this relief was short-lived. "He's got something, man. It's a big bag. He just threw it on the floor and... Oh God, man. The bag... I think it just moved." Josh hadn't been discovered, but I knew he soon would be by the man with the bag. It was hopeless. As I lay there, unable to move, my eyes focused on the corner of the house that was right under my room, right under where Josh would soon be discovered. I moved my flashlight. My breath hitched at what I saw. Animals. Dozens of them. All of them dead. They lay as a heaping pile of fur, claws, and teeth. Time and weather had fused some of them together into grotesque chimeras, their snarling mouths telling the world of their dissatisfaction at the Union. Could boxes be among these corpses? Was this what the cat food was for? For a moment, I thought to move closer. Perhaps, if he was there, I could see him and know the truth. A heavy footstep above me broke my shock. I knew I had to get out of there, and I scrambled to the board. I pushed on it, but it wouldn't budge. I couldn't move it, and I couldn't get my fingers around it since the edges were outside. Josh had put it back the wrong way. I was trapped. "God damn you, Josh!" I whispered to myself. I could feel thunderous footsteps above me. The whole house was shaking. I heard Josh scream, and it was matched by another scream that wasn't full of fear. The storm above continued as I clawed at the board. Their footsteps were tracing patterns on the floor and charting maps of their routes in my mind. They ran from my bedroom to the living room, to the kitchen, to the front door, and around and around. They ran until I didn't hear any more running. I pushed the board as hard as I could, and I felt it move, but I knew it wasn't me who was moving it. I could hear footsteps above me and in front of me, and shouting and screaming, filling the brief silences between the stomping and shoveling. The board moved a little more, and what little ambient light there was outside poured into this new opening. Walkie or flashlight? I had to make the decision of which to use to defend myself. It was so dark outside that I feared I wouldn't make it back to Josh's without the light, but if I broke the walkie-talkie, then Josh and I would be separated completely. The board moved more. I didn't have time to wager any longer. The walkie seemed sturdier, so I moved back and clutched it, ready to strike with all my might. The board was thrown to the side and an arm shot in and grabbed for me. "Let's go, man, now!" It was Josh. Thank God. I scrambled out of the opening, holding the flashlight and the walkie, and we ran as fast as we could to the fence, as the long grass whipped against our legs. I was the first one over the fence, with Josh close behind me. But when Josh hit the street side of the grass, I heard him curse. His walkie strap got caught on the metal tension wire at the top of the fence and pulled loose from his arm, falling on the bad side of the barricade. Quickly, Josh went to climb over the fence to retrieve it, and reflexively I grabbed the back of his shirt, yelling, "Forget it, man! We gotta go!" Behind us, I could hear yelling, though they weren't words, only sounds. Without discussing it, we, perhaps foolishly, ran into the woods in order to get back to Josh's house more quickly, while hopefully being somewhat harder to follow. We tore through thick patches of foliage, which tore back through us, albeit unequally. My arms were stinging with fresh cuts and scrapes from the woodland blockades that attempted to slow us down. The whole way through the woods, Josh kept muttering, "My picture! He took my picture!" I began to feel physically ill from the guilt that this caused in me. I knew the man already had Josh's picture, from when we played as boys in the ditch. I suppose Josh hadn't thought about that day since it happened. Maybe he still thought those mechanical sounds were from a robot. Aside from Josh's mutterings, not a word was shared between us as we hustled through the woods back towards Josh's house. We made it back into his room before his parents woke up. I didn't know how to use his washing machine, and even if I did, it would have made too much noise. After my attempt to scrub the dirt out of my shirt and pants with water from the sink proved unsuccessful, I borrowed some clothes from Josh and reluctantly snuck back outside to throw the incriminating clothes in a large green city trash can that was sitting by the curb. The fact that there were so many trash cans lining the neighborhood road told me that garbage day was somewhere nearby on the calendar, and when I lifted the lid to Josh's trash can and saw it filled with garbage bags, I was relieved that the day hadn't already come. I hesitated for a second, taking the last look at my lizard on my shirt, and then shoved the clothes underneath one of the bags and crept around the house and through Josh's bedroom window. We sat in silence for a while, and it started to become uncomfortable. Finally, to break the quiet in the room, I asked him about the big bag in my old house and if it really moved. He said he couldn't be sure. He apologized about dropping the walkie-talkie at the house, and obviously it wasn't a big deal, all things considered. We didn't go to sleep that night. Instead, we sat peering out the window, waiting for the man with the bag, but he never came. We agreed to never tell anyone about what happened. No good would come from that. After a couple of hours, the sun pushed the darkness out of the sky, and my mom came to get me a couple hours after that. She asked me about the clothes I had on, and I told her that Josh had liked the shirt that I had been wearing and asked if he could borrow it. She said that was nice of me. As we were pulling out of Josh's driveway, my eyes lingered on the trash can at the edge of their yard, and I caught myself whispering, "I thought I closed the lid." I considered that the garbage truck might have just put the trash can down with the lid open, but it didn't matter. The evidence was gone, and I breathed easy. Until very recently, my mother didn't know about what Josh and I had done that night. Of course, I spared many of the details when I told her, but I thought that if I told her something she didn't know, maybe she would reciprocate. By the end of the story, my mother's eyes had glossed over. I asked her why she had lied about bothering the new owners to stop me from going when there weren't any new owners at all. Why had she tried so hard to stop me from going back to our old home? She became irate and hysterical and told me to get out of her house, but I just sat there waiting. When she realized that I wouldn't leave, she sat back down and she answered my question. She grabbed my hand and squeezed it harder than I thought her capable of, and locked her eyes to mine. She whispered through clenched teeth as if she was afraid of being overheard. "Because I never put any fucking blankets or bowls under the house for boxes. You think you were the only one to find them down there? Don't you tell me that I lied to you about there being someone in that house, goddamn you!" I felt dizzy. With those few sentences, I understood so much. I understood why she had looked so uneasy after she brought boxes out from under the house our last day there. She found more than spiders or a rat's nest that day. I understood why we left almost 2 weeks early. I understood why she tried to stop me from going back. She knew. She knew he made his home under ours, and she kept it from me. And as I walked out of her house, I could only think of what else she might know. I left my mother that night without saying another word. I didn't finish the story for her, but I want to finish it here, for you. When I got home from Josh's house that day, I threw my stuff on the floor, and it scattered everywhere. I didn't care. I just wanted to sleep. I woke up about 9 o'clock that night to the sound of boxes meowing. My heart leapt. He'd finally come home. I was a little sick about the fact that I had just wasted a day. None of the previous night's events would have happened, and I'd have boxes anyways, but that didn't matter. He was back. I got off my bed and called for him, looking around to catch a glint of light off his eyes. The crying continued, and I followed it. It was coming from underneath the bed. I laughed a little, thinking I had just crawled under a house looking for him, and how this was so much better. His meows were being muffled by a jacket, so I flung it aside, and smiled, yelling, "Welcome home, boxes!" His cries were coming from my walkie-talkie. Boxes never came home. Sleep tight.